So I'm ready to jump in. It's been a couple of weeks. I was on vacation the last 2 Sundays, and so really enjoyed it. And then first Sunday back was a little hectic this morning. I have to be honest. I almost forgot what announcements I was supposed to make. So at least we've got the word. We're going to preach the word, and I'm just going to stick with that this morning, and hopefully we're good with it. So we're going to be in a book called Habakkuk. And I don't know if any of those K's are silent. There's enough of them that if one of them is silent, we'll just say all of them, Habakkuk. I know that a couple of weeks ago, we had trouble with the silent T with apostle. Is Dave here? Dave preached a couple. No, he's not here. Well, you missed it then. You missed a pretty awesome message there. But anyway, so we're going to be in the book of Habakkuk. It's somewhere near the front of the Bible. You just kind of flip through and you'll find it. You might have to go to your table of contents, but it's a good book. Now, a few years ago, we preached a 3-part sermon series in the book of Habakkuk, and then about a year ago or so, we preached through the minor prophets, and Dan preached through Habakkuk at that time, and so that was another guy on our teaching team. So we've spent some time in Habakkuk over the last few years, but as I've been praying and thinking about what God would have me to share and for us to hear as a church family, I kept being drawn to this story of Habakkuk. And in this book, it seems that he's serving in a priestly or religious role, a prophetic role, in a time that really is pretty chaotic nationally, even internationally. I think it seems that he serves already in a priestly role. He's already a religious person. In other words, there are other prophets in Israel's time where they are farmers or they serve in some other capacity. God says, "Hey, I want you to take this message and go preach it." And so the farmer, like Amos, becomes the prophet. Well, in this case, it seems that Habakkuk is actually like one of the priests. He's one of the prophets already. He's a religious person, but he's also a well-educated person. And in this book, the way it's written, its literary form is one of the most significant of all the minor prophets. So in my estimation, he's one of the more educated writers of the minor prophets. And the content here in Habakkuk is probably what makes it my favorite of the minor prophets. They're all so good. They're all so rich. But I think it's good to look at the time that Habakkuk comes from. He comes to us from a time, like I said, like ours, except there's a little bit of a trajectory that the nation is on. The nation has had its ups and downs. It's like every 4 years we go from good king to bad king. Any semblance there? So I think what happens here is, they get a season of a good king, one that, the majority likes. And then the next season, it seems like they get an evil king and the majority doesn't like, or it's back and forth. It's up and down. There's a good king, then there's an evil king. And so they're jarred. The people of Israel are in a place where they feel jarred. They feel sort of unaware or unsure about what's going on. Politically, that's nationally, that's internationally. So at the time that Habakkuk is serving, there's what we know as the 8-year-old king who takes the throne. His name is Josiah. Josiah takes the throne, and this 8-year-old boy begins to turn the nation to God. He begins to see the law as a moral outpost for God's kingdom, and he begins to actually institute the law as guiding principle for the nation and turning God's people back to himself. So there seems to be a little bit of a turning back to God among the people. And I think that the people of God renew their commitment to God. They begin to establish themselves as an independent nation apart from the Assyrians and all of their oppression. And you can almost get the sense that things are going really well. There's a ton of hope here for Israel. And after Josiah dies, his son Jehoiakim takes the throne and proves to be just as evil as any of the other evil kings. And I think what we're seeing here is the aftermath. What we're reading in the book of Habakkuk is the aftermath of watching the nation sort of come into revival in a way, come into a strong sense of nationalism, and then to see this evil king sort of break it all down, watch it all fall apart. And he's commenting through the book of Habakkuk on what it looks like, what it feels like at that time. I think the nation begins its downward spiral, morally, economically. And Habakkuk's beginning to realize that the sin and the evil in the nation are destroying the nation. Look how he describes it. Would you turn to Habakkuk 1? We'll just read the first 4 verses at this point. We'll just keep working our way through Habakkuk. I'm going to do sort of a quick overview, almost like a summary of the three-part sermon series we did just a couple of years ago. So as we study this together, we're not going to study it in detail, but I do want you to see some of these things that stand out to me as I read Habakkuk. And some of these things are what make it my favorite. Here it is in verse 1 of chapter 1 in Habakkuk. This is the message that the prophet Habakkuk received in a vision. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Stop right there for a sec. I mean, regardless of what might be happening in Habakkuk's heart and mind, or what might be happening in Habakkuk's time, have any of you ever felt like this? There's a part of me that resonates with so much of what I read in Habakkuk 1 and 2 and even chapter 3. It's just 3 chapters, and every time I read it, it feels like there's so much that resonates with me. How long must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere, I cry, but you're not coming to save. You do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Do they have to be right here in front of me? How long will I have to look at this evil? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. Does any of this sound familiar? Yeah. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted. Justice is inside out. It's backwards. It's going the wrong way. It's a plane flying upside down. What we're looking at here is something that I think so many of us can resonate with. And sometimes it feels like it resonates with me on an international level, just hearing of Christians being persecuted internationally, hearing of war internationally. Sometimes it grieves me even just nationally with all that is happening in our own nation. And then other times it grieves me just even in my own heart with the sin that seems to plague me. And I'm asking God, how long before we're done with all of this? How many more times will I struggle with this? And I think for me, I guess the reason I'm saying this is I think no matter where you're at or what seems to be your most significant tension, Habakkuk really speaks to it. Well, as we look at this, I wonder if Habakkuk, as he makes this statement to God, I wonder if he doesn't hope or expect that God might send another king to make things right again. In other words, I wonder if he's not hoping that in light of what was so good and in light of what's now so bad, that someone would come and just make Israel great again. It doesn't work that way. I don't mean to draw a one-to-one correlation politically with everything we're going through, but I think it is important for me to at least tell you that there is no religious leader, there is no political leader who can save us. God alone is our King. You know what the church was in so much trouble for in the early days, in those early churches, as the church was getting started in the book of Acts? They were citing to Caesar and to the officials of the town, these people are saying there is no king but Jesus. It's true. We pledge allegiance to no one but the King, and to no kingdom but his kingdom. This has to be our utmost allegiance. It has to be the truth that shakes us to our core. It has to be our guiding perspective. It has to be a guiding principle for us, or I think we lose our sure footing. What's happening here for Habakkuk is that I think when you go from chapter 1, verse 1 through 4, like we just read, and then you get all the way to chapter, and you see the discouragement there, you can hear it in his voice, and then you get all the way to the end of chapter 3, verse 3, you see him turn a corner, and you see him placing his faith or his feet on solid ground. That's what I want us to discover at the end of this message. It's just a quick message, but that's the overview and that's the trajectory. He's seeing injustice and violence all around him, and he's grieved by what God tells him here next. Look at verse 5. This is Habakkuk 1, chapter 1, verse 5. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations, look and be amazed. I'm doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it. Now, television preachers love to preach this verse in hopes of just sort of awakening your passion to maybe do more or give more or hope more. In other words, hey, look around you. I'm doing something that's really awesome in your day, and you never would believe it if someone told you about it. Yeah, only that what this prophecy pertains to is utter destruction. The context for this is not like, hey, listen, set your eyes on God, good things are coming, man. No, it's actually pretty devastating. He says, I'm going to do something that you wouldn't believe if I told you about it. I'm going to burn the house down. Is that crazy? Look what he says here in verse 6. He says, I'm raising up the Babylonians, a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and will conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty, and they do whatever they like. Skip down to verse 9. Here they come, all bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, sweeping captives ahead of them like the sand. Verse 11. They sweep past like the wind and are gone, but they are deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God. That's all that's on the screen. I'm going to read this next part. Habakkuk hears what God is saying, and he really can't believe it. And he says, Lord, my God, my Holy One, you who are eternal, surely you do not plan to wipe us out. O Lord, our rock, you have sent these Babylonians to correct us, sure, and to punish us for our many sins, but you are pure and cannot stand the sight of evil. Will you wink at their treachery? Will you be silent while the wicked swallow up more people who are more righteous than they? What Habakkuk is saying here is these people are way more evil than we are. You're going to punish us with people more evil than us? And to save on time a little bit, what God says is, oh, no, I'm going to punish them too. They'll get what's coming to them too, all in good time. And I guess that's what I'm thinking. I guess that's what I'm thinking in relationship to all that we're experiencing in our own lives. One of the first points I have for us is that God cares deeply about justice. It's just that he's working on his timetable, not ours. He cares deeply about justice. When Habakkuk says, wait a second, it seems like the balances are skewed here, God. You're going to let a more wicked nation than us come in and punish us who are more righteous than they are? And God says, no. Everyone gets what's coming to them. I'm going to punish you, your people, with the Babylonians. But what they don't know is that their own strength is their idol. And I intend to come and punish them for their evil too. It's just going to take time, Habakkuk. See, Habakkuk gets the benefit of a conversation with God where God says, no, just in about 500 years, you'll see what I'm talking about. Whereas we don't have that benefit, right? We're waiting for the next, election cycle, whether that's the Congress or the executive branch. We're waiting for the next election cycle, but guys, I'm telling you, God's justice plays out for the long haul. Which is why we can't let ourselves be so overwhelmed or so negatively affected by what's happening to us in the present circumstance. Now, I'm going to get to something in just a minute that says that we should work to alleviate suffering and we should pursue justice, no doubt about it, but we do it coming from a place of resting in God's sovereignty or his providence for us, knowing that he is in it for the long game and that he has a plan that is working itself out. There's no reason to fear. There's no reason to be dismayed. We're the ones with the good news. And so I think we stand on the good news, firmly secure on the one who is the King, living and enjoying his kingdom and proclaiming that anyone who would believe can come and be a part of what we're experiencing. This is the good news. And I think what's important for us to see is that God is a God of justice. And if he seems silent, if it seems for all of your prayers there are no answers, if it seems like maybe he's unaware of what's happening, I don't think we should be mistaken in that way. The Bible teaches us, and here's a verse that I have for us, it's Psalm 68:5, that God is a father to the fatherless, a defender of the widows. He is in his holy place. We have nothing to fear. God is taking care of us. Galatians 6:7 says, do not be deceived. In other words, don't misunderstand this now. God is not mocked. Whatever one sows, he will also reap that. That's Galatians 6:7. I think the prophet is probably expecting that God would send someone to make things right, but I don't think he could have anticipated God's response. And what I think is important for us to remember is that there will always be sin in our existence here on earth until God comes to eradicate it fully. There will always be sin and brokenness. There'll always be injustice and violence. And this sin calls for justice. We feel it in our hearts, but it also calls for God to do something about it. And I think what is important for us to see are sort of past, present, and future as it pertains to God's justice. Meaning, he has done something about it, he is doing something about it, and he will do something about it. We have to believe that. I think we lose our footing if we don't. We have to believe it. What I mean is that he has rendered justice in the past through the sacrifice of his son, Jesus. It starts there, it doesn't end there. That's the good news. What I'm saying here is like what you might read in Habakkuk 13. It's a verse that we didn't read, but I want you to see it. It's Habakkuk crying out to God, and he says, but you are pure, God. You cannot stand the sight of evil. Will you wink at their treachery? And then it's the phrase that we just addressed just a second ago. Will you keep silent while the wicked swallow up people more righteous than they are? Well, no, surely not, right? Well, when you look at what Jesus Christ did for us, it's a man who did no evil, suffering the consequences for people more wicked than he. Just to use that language, not that he was wicked at all. But to borrow from what we're reading here, what we're seeing is Habakkuk is a little bit struck here by the notion that God might actually execute justice on a more innocent nation through the nation that is more evil than they are. And I think there's a foreshadowing of the gospel that might be good for you to study and tease out on your own. But what happens in the good news of Jesus Christ is what we find in 2 Corinthians 5:21. This is the justice that God has played out for us in his Son. 2 Corinthians 5:21 says, for our sake, for a people who are wicked, for our sake, God made him, Jesus, to be sin for us who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The greater, suffering all the consequences for the evil. There's the gospel for us here. When we look at all the injustice that's around us, I don't think it's fair to say, where is God and what has he done or what is he doing? I think in the first place, we go back to what he has done. We'll get to what he is doing and what he will do, but we go back to what he has done, and we see God is actively working to render justice, but he's carrying it out not on the ones who deserve it, mind you. It's on the one who doesn't deserve it. It's his son, Jesus. And so when you ask, where is justice, if you don't have the cross in mind, if you don't have Jesus dying on the cross to pay for our sins, to take our place, our punishment for the penalty of our sin, if you don't have that in view, then you have no way to measure how to account for justice. And I would say that anytime that someone offends us, or anytime that we're hurt, or anytime that there's sin or that there's evil, I don't think we can accurately say God is not doing anything about it. I think we have to say confidently, he has done something about it. He has. He sent his son, and he's carried out justice on his son for our sake so that we could have eternal salvation. But he's also doing something about it presently. He is still at work through Jesus, but through his body. I mean, it's sort of a trite saying, but I mean, it's in the scriptures, so I don't want it to sound sort of Christian subculture-ish, but we are his hands and his feet. He is doing something about injustice. He's doing it through his people. The ones who understand and are able to rest in what God has done find the freedom and the energy and all the resources they need to do what God asks them to do by way of justice, by way of love. We're called to do that. We are the active presence of God in our time today. And not only that, not only has he done something, not only is he doing something through his body, through the body of Christ, which is us, he also will do something. This is also a great hope for us. So at one point, Jesus comes and he sacrifices himself as a lamb. And then at the end of the New Testament, we see Jesus Christ actually coming back as the lion to render justice once and for all. Do you know that sometimes the injustice we face, I'm talking just personally, now the nations will have to own up for their responsibility before God. But I think we will too. And I think as we stand before God, whenever there's injustice as it pertains to us, or as it pertains to the nation, or as it pertains to international drama, we have to realize and truly believe that if it doesn't get worked out in the next 5 years or in the next 30 years I have before I turn 75 and pass away, that at some point in the distant future, because God's justice plays the long game, he'll work it out. He'll make it right. We have to believe that. In fact, Habakkuk died never seeing the promise that God gave him, which was that the Babylonians will be wiped out. I'll deal with them in my time, Habakkuk. There's something I want for you. I want you to live and walk in faith. And that's the message of Habakkuk. So I think God has done something in terms of justice. He is doing something in terms of justice. He will do something in terms of justice. He will come back and he will make all things right. He will set everything in its place. He's a good king. And I think that as we work toward justice in the present era and this time we're in, I think we have to do look back to what he's done and look forward to what he's going to do, and we have to draw strength from that in order to show the kind of love that he's asking. It's like the song we sang, pour out your spirit on us so that your love is overflowing out of us. What is justice if it's not the essence of love? And I think we find strength to love, renewed energy to love, when we can look back and see Christ has handled this. And we can look forward and say, he's going to come and handle this. There's freedom for us there. I think in almost every single case where we as a people are seeking justice, personally, nationally, locally, whatever, in almost every single case where we are seeking justice, we want it sooner than God delivers and in more specific ways than God delivers. Is that true? It is for me. I want it now. I want them to pay now. I want everyone to know the truth. It's not what they said. This is the truth. I want justice. I want vindication. I want it to be made right. Of course, unless it pertains to my sin. Then I think, God's long haul thing, I'm good with that. I'm being sort of kidding here, but there's, sometimes a ton of grace for us and a ton of harshness toward others. But I think when we look at God's justice and someone offends us in some way or says something about us in some way, we look at the cross and we go, okay, that was dealt with. They don't need to be punished, and I don't need to seek out their punishment. I'll let God deal with that. What I know is Jesus was punished, not just for my sins, but for the sins of the whole world, and that includes the person who offended me. In other words, I think when we hunger for justice, the best way to see it fully conveyed is looking at the cross of Jesus and realizing he was brutally murdered. He died for that sin too. And to the degree we really understand that, to the degree that that really resonates with us, that's the degree to which I think it alleviates our desire for vindication or any retribution to those who might do us evil or wrong. In other words, there's true freedom, legitimate freedom, not theoretical freedom, but for real freedom when we look at what Christ has done and realize that he paid for that sin. Justice has been met. Now what am I free to do? Well, there's no vindication. There's no retribution. There's no evil on my part. I guess I'm free to love. I guess I'm free to pursue justice. I guess I'm free to pursue what is in their best interest to see that they might come to the same understanding I have, which is the good news of Jesus Christ and what he's done to save us. See, there's only freedom then to do what God calls us to do. That's what I think it means when Paul talks about the fruit of the Spirit, following the Spirit, being filled with the Spirit. He says, The fruit of the Spirit is, what is the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And then he says, against such, there is no what? You're never going to break the law doing what God calls you to do. The issue is always we're doing more than he called us to do or less than he called us to do. But you never break the law when you're filled with the Spirit doing what he calls you to do. So I think there's two things we need to do. And I'm going to go right over to Ephesians and try to wrap this up. So our clock broke. And I know you guys are disappointed, but okay, I have a clock up here. Sorry. So can we get a clock for next week? Let's just go over to Ephesians 1. Will you look at something for me? Everything you need to know about the entire Bible is in Ephesians chapter 1. You get an NLT version like I've got and preach from now, just because it's easier to read. There's no real theological shift in my perspective. It just really has been easier for me to read. So I'm reading from an NLT, reading Ephesians chapter 1 and seeing it in just fresh eyes. It's beautiful. Everything you need to know about the gospel of Jesus Christ, all that God has been doing, all that he is doing, and all that he will do is in Ephesians chapter 1. Is that not, that's not hype. That's for real, guys. Go and read Ephesians chapter 1. So let me get over to Ephesians chapter 1. We're not going to read the whole thing, even after I gave it such high marks. I want you to see chapter 1, verse 4. It says, even before he made the world, God loved us, and he chose us in Christ to be holy and without fault in his eyes. The reason I'm pointing that out is because I think the two things he mentions here that are really significant, it might help us sort of turn the corner on some of what we're seeing is I don't think we can act in a way so as to render justice or to be overflowing in love if we don't acknowledge two things. And one is his love for us. If we're not rooted and grounded in his love for us. Until we've received God's love and have become made aware of his love, I don't think we truly understand love. And I don't think we're truly motivated by love. So the first point is what he says in Ephesians 4 here. God has loved us. We have to be convinced of that. You're going to go out and conquer the world, and if you don't understand and haven't received God's love for you, there's some other motive at play. There's something else at work, but it's not God's love. If God's love isn't in you, it's not what you're giving. That's just the truth. So we have to be filled with an awareness of God's love. And then I think secondly, we have to understand that God has chosen us in Christ to be holy and without fault in his eyes. God has chosen us to be holy. Can I define holiness for you? We've done it a number of ways. One way I like to define it is just dedication. You're just dedicated to Jesus. That's holiness. Another way to define it, one of the latest ways I've been defining it just in my own mind and heart, not publicly or anything, is loyalty to the King. That's holiness. What I'm getting at here is I think the two things we need to be fully convinced of are, number one, God's love for us, and number two, God's call for us. Holiness is just following where he calls us. That's holiness. You never break the law when you're filled with the Spirit. That's what God has for us. And I think for us, what we have to do is really come to a sense where we're convinced of God's love, we're motivated by God's love, and then we determine what God is calling us to do. Now, if you're like me and a little bit of a cynic, isn't calling something that's a bit subjective at times, right? God's calling me to start a, hamster ministry for Anchor Church. Okay, great. Yeah, sounds good. Sounds like God might be calling you to do that. It seems that way when someone tells me like, hey, God's called me to do something. So if you come and tell me that, I don't want you to feel like, well, I can't tell him God called me to do something. No, I don't want you to feel that way. I'm just saying, does it not feel to you sometimes like when someone says God called me or God said something, it's like, okay, well, yeah, maybe he did, sure. Well, I think there are some helpful things we can do to really try to get to the bottom of what God might be calling us to do. Can I just run through these with you? These come from a friend of mine who, at a dinner conversation, just sort of ran down this list, and then I've kind of tweaked it and added to it. But if you're looking for calling, I think first you have to ask yourself, is there inward desire? If you're taking notes, there's probably about 7 of these. This is a good rubric. Is there inward desire? Is there a growing desire in your heart to do it? Yeah, it sounds really it sounds self-righteous when someone's like, well, I just didn't want to do it. I don't want to do it, but I know God wants me to. Okay, well, maybe that's true, and that's probably true in some circumstances. But, when God's calling you to do something, generally there's a growing desire for that thing. So I don't know that we have to feign humility. We can just say, that's what I want to do. I want to be a preacher. I want to be a pastor. I want to be a small group leader. I want to go and I want to do something in my workforce. I want to be the guy that starts that social club. I want to be the president of my neighborhood association, and I want to see change just in my neighborhood. Or whatever you can dream or whatever you can vision. If there's a growing desire for something, start there. And see where God might be calling you to bring justice in your own sphere of influence. Start there. Is there a growing desire for something? And then I think this next one is so crucial. Is there outward affirmation? Are other godly men and women affirming you should do that? That's so critical. So, whenever I ask for someone who would like to join the worship team, or for someone who would like to teach, or whenever there's someone who says that they would like to start a church, one of my first questions is, hey, so who's telling you that's a good idea? Has anyone ever told you you could sing? Do you generally get good comments? How many people are you discipling? How many people are you teaching and it's effective and they say, man, you're a teacher? Or, is there any board of elders that says you should be starting this church? In general, those are just sort of the realm I'm working in, but I think we can probably all just relate. Like, yeah, there needs to be someone outside of your own head saying, hey, I affirm that. That's a good calling. That's why you need community. You can't discern God's will on your own every time. You can't do it. It's not meant to be that way. It's not how it's designed. So there's inward desire, there's outward affirmation, and then I think there's character or moral qualifications. Meaning, am I living in line with God's Spirit? Am I obedient to Him? And I think that's where we would bring in holiness and say, am I following Him? Is it clear from His Word, from His church, and from His Spirit that I should do this? Do I have the skill to do this? That's the next one. The next one is there a need for this? The next one is there an opportunity? Is there an open door in front of me? And then the last one comes no less than 12 months after you've done this. Do I still find joy in it? Sometimes you can be really good at something, and a year or two into it, or 5 years into it, or 10 years into it, you can just lose joy. You lose desire for it. And honestly, that's sometimes an indication of calling. It sounds crazy. Sometimes it's an indication you just need to get right. You need to get your heart right. Submit to Jesus and do what He's calling you to do. But there are other times too where I think we shouldn't give people such a hard time when they just are losing joy or losing desire for something. That might be an indication that actually God's calling you elsewhere or to do something else. So I think that's sort of a bit of a rubric, and I'm kind of done. I'm out of my time, but chapter 3 ends with a verse that I'm going to read for us and then just close our service. Chapter 3 ends with Habakkuk saying this. Look at chapter 3, verse 17 to 19. Let me get back over there. Man, these little books are hard to find. All right. Chapter 3, verse 17. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms, he's saying, look, it's a bad place around here right now. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, look at verse 18. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. There's the confidence that God loves us. And then verse 19, the sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as the deer, able to tread upon the heights. And there's God's calling on our life. When you do what God's calling you to do, there's endless energy and endless resources. He always provides. You know what my issue is? I'm either doing more than He called or less than He called.